The phone felt heavier than it should have that afternoon. I remember standing in the middle of that restaurant. Every eye in the dining room turned toward me. The silence so thick you could have cut it with the steak knife, still sitting untouched on my table. I looked at the owner, a man I had never met before that moment, and I said 4 words into the receiver that I had never said to anyone in my 64 years on this earth. I am closing it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the phone down. I simply set it on the white tablecloth, straightened my jacket, and looked at my son, Marcus Jr., sitting across from me with his mouth open. He had seen me negotiate million-dollar contracts. He had watched me navigate boardroom betrayals that would have broken younger men. But he had never seen me like this, calm, absolute, done. To understand how a retired businessman from Charlotte, North Carolina ends up shutting down a restaurant on Father's Day, you need to go back 3 weeks. You need to understand who I am, what that day meant to me, and what that young woman did to cross the line I didn't know I had until she crossed it. Before we go back, I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you believe that dignity is non-negotiable at any age, hit that like button and subscribe. This community was built for people who understand that some things are worth standing up for. Now let me take you back to where this story really begins. My name is Harold James Whitfield. I was born in 1961 in Gastonia, North Carolina, the third of 5 children raised by a woman who cleaned other people's houses 6 days a week and a man who pressed suits at a dry cleaner on Beatty's Ford Road. My parents never complained. They never asked for sympathy. What they gave us instead was a code, a way of carrying yourself through the world that said, regardless of what anyone does to you, you do not lose yourself. You do not become what they want you to be in that moment of disrespect. You think. You plan. You respond with precision. I spent 31 years building Whitfield Logistics Solutions, a freight and supply chain management company that I started out of a one-room office on South Tryon Street in 1992 with a second-hand desk and a phone line I shared with the insurance broker next door. By the time I sold my majority stake in 2019, we had offices in Charlotte, Atlanta, and Houston, employed over 300 people, and had contracts with 4 of the top 15 retailers in the southeastern United States. I was not a man who needed to announce himself. My record did that for me. I retired at 62, not because I was tired, but because I had promised my late wife, Carolyn, that when Marcus Jr. graduated from Morehouse, I would finally slow down. She passed from ovarian cancer in 2017, 14 months before our son walked across that stage in Atlanta. I kept my promise anyway. She would have wanted me to. By the time Father's Day came around in June of last year, I had settled into a rhythm that suited me. Tuesday mornings at First Baptist on Beatty's Ford. Thursday golf at Regent Park Golf Club with my friend and former business partner, Raymond Ellis. Weekends either with Marcus Jr. or driving up to Greensboro to see my sister Diane and her grandchildren. I had built a good life, a quiet life. The kind of life that only feels earned when you understand what it cost. Marcus Jr. was the one who suggested Magnolia Table that year. It had opened 14 months prior on East Boulevard in the Dilworth neighborhood. A neighborhood I had watched transform over 20 years from working class to upscale, from corner stores to wine bars. The restaurant had received a favorable review in the Charlotte Observer and a feature in South Park magazine. The menu was upscale Southern, the kind of place that called macaroni and cheese, artisanal grain casserole, and charged $32 for it. I had no objection. My son wanted to celebrate. That was enough. We made a reservation for 1 p.m. A party of 3, myself, Marcus Jr., and his girlfriend Priya Chandrasekaran, a cardiologist at Atrium Health, whom I genuinely liked for her intelligence and her refusal to laugh at jokes that weren't funny. We arrived at 12:58 p.m. Marcus Jr., was wearing the navy blazer I had bought him for his birthday. Priya had flowers, which she gave to me at the door, a gesture so thoughtful it nearly caught me off guard. I was wearing my charcoal Anderson and shepherd suit, the one I had made in London in 2015, with a white pocket square and the watch Carolyn had given me for our 25th anniversary, a Jaeger LeCoultre Reverso that I wore only on days that mattered. The hostess seated us promptly. The table was near the window, which I appreciated. The dining room was full but not chaotic, perhaps 30 tables. Soft jazz playing at a volume that invited conversation rather than shouted over it. I noticed the decor: exposed brick, warm Edison lighting, local artwork on the walls. Someone had put real thought into this place. I gave it credit for that. Our server arrived within 4 minutes. Her name tag said Brittany. She was a young white woman, perhaps 24 or 25. With her hair pulled back and the careful smile of someone trained to project warmth without necessarily feeling it. She greeted Marcus Jr. first, then Priya, then placed the menus on the table without looking at me directly. I thought nothing of it. She took our drink orders. Marcus Jr. asked for sparkling water. Priya ordered an iced tea. I asked for still water and said I'd also like to start with a glass of the Stag's Leap Cabernet Sauvignon, if they had it by the glass. She wrote something down, nodded at the other two, and walked away. 12 minutes passed. The drinks for Marcus Jr. and Priya arrived, brought by a food runner, not Brittany. My water was not there. My wine was not there. I assumed an oversight. These things happen in busy restaurants. I had managed people for 30 years. I understood operational chaos. Marcus Jr. noticed before I mentioned it. He flagged down a passing server, not our table server, and asked if someone could bring his father's water. The server, a young black man who looked genuinely embarrassed, brought the water within 90 seconds and apologized. Still no wine. Brittany returned 5 minutes later. She asked Marcus Jr. and Priya if they were ready to order. She did not look at me. She did not ask me. She held her notepad toward them as if I were not seated at the same table. "I believe my father also needs to order," Marcus Jr. said, his voice measured, his eyes steady. Brittany glanced in my direction, not at me, past me, and said, "I'll come back." Then she turned and walked to a table across the room. The table went quiet. Priya set down her glass. Marcus Jr.'s jaw tightened. I placed my hand flat on the tablecloth, a gesture my children learned to recognize. It meant, "Not here, not now, let me handle this." I sat with that feeling for a moment. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something more precise. The recognition of intentional disregard. There is a difference between being overlooked by someone who is busy and being looked through by someone who has decided you do not exist. Brittany was not overwhelmed. She was not distracted. She was making a choice with every non-interaction, and the choice was deliberate. 27 minutes into our reservation, we had not ordered food. My wine had never materialized. Marcus Jr.'s water had been refilled once by the same apologetic young man from before. Brittany had visited our table 3 more times, each time directing her words and attention exclusively to my son and his girlfriend. On the 4th visit, she set a dessert menu on the table. "We haven't ordered food yet," Priya said, with the quiet firmness of a woman who spent her professional life telling people difficult truths. Brittany blinked. "Oh, did nobody come to take your order?" "You've been to this table 4 times, Marcus Jr. said. "I'm so sorry about that." She said it to the air between Marcus Jr. and Priya. "What can I get for you?" She took their orders. She looked at her notepad. She did not ask me what I wanted. When she began to turn, I spoke. "I would also like to order." She stopped. She turned back. For the first time since we had sat down, Brittany looked directly at me. And what I saw in that look, it was not malice, exactly. It was something I had encountered before, something more insidious than outright hostility. It was the particular expression of someone who had decided, at a fundamental level, that my presence required no acknowledgement. She looked at me the way some people look at furniture. "What would you like?" she said. Flat. No notepad. No pen raised. "The pan-seared redfish," I said, "with the roasted fingerling potatoes and the broccolini. And I would still like that Stag's Leap Cabernet, if it's available." She walked away without writing anything down. I thought perhaps she had a remarkable memory. I was wrong. 41 minutes later, Marcus Jr. and Priya's food arrived. Mine did not. The food runner set 2 plates on the table, said, "Enjoy," and left before any of us could speak. Marcus Jr. immediately pushed his plate aside and said he wasn't eating until my food came. Priya did the same. I told them not to do that. Their food would get cold. This was my day, and I was not going to let it become a grievance that ruined the meal for the 2 people who had worked to make it special. I flagged down the same young man. His name tag said Dion, and asked quietly if he could check on my order. He came back 3 minutes later with an expression that told me everything before he opened his mouth. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I can't find your order in the system." There it was. She had never entered it. I looked at Marcus Jr., I looked at Priya. I set my napkin on the table, folded neatly, the way my mother had taught me to leave a table. And I stood up. The story could have ended there. I could have walked out quietly, written a review online, and never returned. That is what most people would have done. That is, I confess, what I considered for approximately 4 seconds as I buttoned my jacket and felt the weight of 31. Years of building something with my hands pressing down on my shoulders like the hand of a patient, experienced man. But then Brittany walked by. She passed within 3 feet of our table, looked directly at me standing there, and a man in the bespoke suit on Father's Day who had spent 41 minutes being invisible, and she smiled. Not at me, past me, at the table behind us. And that was the moment I understood that this wasn't carelessness. This was a message. I sat back down. I asked Dion to bring me the check for the drinks. I paid it in cash, $41, and I left a $40 tip for Dion, specifically, folding the bills and placing them in his hand directly. I looked him in the eye and said, "This has nothing to do with you. You've been excellent." He thanked me in a voice so low I almost didn't hear it. Marcus Jr. was already on his phone. "Dad, I'm pulling up the owner's contact." "Not yet," I said. Let me think. That was the part that my son never fully understood about me. The pause. The stillness that people sometimes mistook for passivity, and that was, in reality, the most dangerous thing about me. I had not built a 31-year company by reacting. I had built it by understanding. And what I needed to understand first was exactly what I was dealing with. We drove to Ameli's French Bakery on North Davidson Street and had lunch there instead. Avocado toast and quiche and very good coffee. And Marcus Jr. told me more than once that I didn't have to let this go. I told him I wasn't letting anything go. I was simply taking inventory before I moved. On the drive home that evening, I made 3 decisions. The first was to say nothing publicly for at least 2 weeks. The second was to find out everything I could about Magnolia Table, its ownership structure, its business licenses, its health inspection history, its lease situation. The third was to call Raymond Ellis, because Raymond, before he became my golf partner and my friend, I'd spent 22 years as a commercial real estate attorney, and Raymond knew things about how Charlotte's restaurant corridor operated that most people never thought to ask. What I found over the next 18 days was more than I had expected. Magnolia Table was owned and operated by a man named Gregory Davenport, 47, originally from Raleigh. The restaurant itself was incorporated as Davenport Hospitality Group, LLC, a cursory search of North Carolina, Business records showed that this was Davenport's fourth restaurant concept in 8 years. The previous 3 had closed, 2 of them under circumstances that included unresolved vendor disputes and 1 complaint filed with the NC Department of Labor regarding unpaid wages to kitchen staff. More interesting was what Raymond told me during our Thursday golf round, standing at the 4th hole at Regent Park with the late June heat pressing down on us like something with weight. "You know who owns the building on East Boulevard?" Raymond said, lining up his shot. "I don't. Hargrove Capital Partners." He swung. Clean contact, slightly right of center. "And you know who owns 18% of Hargrove Capital Partners?" I waited. Consolidated Southeast Realty Trust. He handed his club to his bag, which you helped establish in 2011 with 4 other investors when that corridor was still blighted. I stood very still. "Harold," Raymond said, picking up his bag, "you are, in a technical sense, a minority stakeholder in the entity that owns the building that man is renting." I had forgotten. Genuinely forgotten. The 2011 investment had been a favor to a colleague more than a strategy. $40,000 into a real estate consortium that I had thought of as little more than a footnote in my portfolio for the past 13 years. I had never expected it to be relevant to anything except a quarterly distribution statement, but it was relevant now. I did not act immediately on what Raymond told me. That would have been impulsive, and impulsive was not something I could afford to be, not in business, not in life, and certainly not in a situation where the wrong move could reduce a legitimate grievance to the appearance of a personal vendetta. I had watched men with better cases than mine lose everything because they moved from emotion instead of strategy. I was not going to be one of those men. Instead, I drove home that Thursday evening, made myself a cup of Folgers, the same brand my mother had kept on the counter every morning of my childhood, and one I had never been able to replace with anything fancier, regardless of what the coffee shops on South Boulevard tried to sell me, and I sat at the kitchen table my late wife, Carolyn, had picked out at an estate sale in Concord in 2003. It was a solid cherrywood piece, wide enough to spread papers across, and I had done some of the most important thinking of my professional life at that table. I opened a yellow legal pad, also a habit from my mother, who believed that a thought written by hand was a thought you were serious about, and I wrote down everything I remembered about Father's Day, the time we arrived, the name on the server's tag, the specific sequence of events, the things that were said, the things that were deliberately not said. I wrote it in the ordered, factual style I had used for 31 years when preparing for negotiations. No adjectives that couldn't be defended. No language that imported interpretation where observation would do. By the time I finished, I had 3 pages of notes and the beginning of a clear picture. Then I spent the following 4 days making quiet phone calls. The first was to Derek Hargrove, the managing partner of Hargrove Capital Partners, whom I had met twice at industry events in the years since the 2011 investment, once at a Charlotte Chamber dinner, and once at a commercial real estate symposium at the Westin on College Street. He was a methodical man in his late 50s, with the careful manner of someone who had learned that silence in a room was worth more than most words. He received my call on the second ring, which told me he still kept his personal line accessible to investors. I explained that I had a specific interest in one of the tenant properties his firm managed on East Boulevard. I did not mention the restaurant by name. I did not explain the nature of my interest. I simply referenced my position as a minority stakeholder in Consolidated Southeast Realty Trust and asked if he could send me the current lease documentation for that address. There was a brief pause, the pause of a man running the calculus of what he was being asked and what it might mean, and then he said he would have it to me by the following morning. It arrived at 7:14 a.m. 14 pages, standard commercial lease format, executed in March of the prior year. I read it twice, slowly, the way I had once read every vendor contract that crossed my desk before I had staff to review them for me. The lease told a story that Gregory Davenport almost certainly did not expect anyone to read this carefully. Section 14B contained the standard conduct clause, a stipulation that the tenant was expected to operate the premises in a manner consistent with the established character and commercial reputation of the surrounding district. This was boilerplate, the kind of language that appears in leases and is rarely invoked. But Section 19C was more specific. It gave the trust explicit authority to initiate a formal review of the lease agreement in the event of documented complaints pertaining to discriminatory practices or violations of applicable public accommodation law. A review under those terms could result in a probationary period, renegotiation of terms, or, in cases where violations were substantiated and unaddressed, early termination proceedings. I set the lease on the kitchen table next to my legal pad and looked at it for a long time. Then I did something that some people might have considered excessive. I drove back to Magnolia Table. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after Father's Day, and I went alone. I dressed deliberately, not in the Anderson and Shepherd suit, which announced itself, but in a pair of dark gray slacks and a simple white polo shirt, the kind of outfit that reads as presentable, but not memorable. I wanted to observe, not be observed. I sat at the bar, ordered a coffee, $12 for a pour-over, which I considered a philosophical statement about the neighborhood, and I watched the floor for 31 minutes. What I saw in those 31 minutes confirmed what my body had already known on Father's Day, the way your body knows certain things before your mind catches up. There was a table of 4 black women in the far corner, professional looking, dressed well, clearly celebrating something given the small wrapped gift on the table. They sat for 11 minutes before a fervor approached them. I counted. The table of 2 white women seated 3 minutes after them had their drink orders taken within 90 seconds of sitting down. I watched Brittany specifically. She was working the floor that afternoon, and I watched how she moved between tables. There was a rhythm to her inattention that was too consistent to be accidental. She knew exactly which table she was minimizing, and she had apparently calculated that the minimized tables would not cause her problems. She had calculated wrong. There was also an elderly black couple near the window, a man perhaps 70, in a press shirt, and a woman beside him who reminded me so much of my Aunt Geneva that I had to look away for a moment. Their water glasses sat empty for the duration of my visit. I watched 3 different servers pass their table without stopping. The man finally held up his hand, a gesture so familiar, so specifically the gesture of a black man in America who has spent decades signaling for basic service, and a young food runner refilled their water with an apology that suggested he had noticed but hadn't known what to do about the climate that allowed it. I finished my coffee, left $12 on the bar, and walked out into the June heat feeling something that was not anger. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was a determination so settled and specific that it had no need for heat. It simply sat in my chest like a stone with a known weight. That same evening, I called Patricia Odom Washington. Patricia and I had known each other for 22 years, first as professional acquaintances and later as something closer to mutual respect that didn't require frequent contact to remain warm. She had retired 3 years prior from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Human Relations Commission, where she had spent the better part of 2 decades as a senior investigator. She was 67 years old, spoke with the considered precision of a woman who had learned that every word in a formal complaint had to be defensible, and she had, in my estimation, forgotten more about North Carolina public accommodation law than most practicing attorneys ever learned. I described what I had experienced on Father's Day and what I had observed on the Tuesday return visit. I gave her dates, times, the name from the server's tag, the specific sequences of service or the absence of it. I described the Father's Day receipt which I had kept, with its itemized drink orders and the absence of any food order for the table's third occupant. I described Dion's statement that my order was not in the system. Patricia listened without interrupting once. When I finished, the silence on the line lasted perhaps 5 seconds, a deliberate silence. The silence of someone organizing what they'd heard into the correct categories. "Harold," she said, "what you're describing, both visits taken together, constitutes a documented pattern of selective service denial based on race. That falls under North Carolina General Statute 99-1, which prohibits discrimination in places of public accommodation. The Father's Day receipt with timestamps is particularly useful because it documents the absence of service in writing." "That's not nothing. I also have notes," I said. "Written the same evening. Dates, times, names, sequences. Good. Contemporary notes carry weight." She paused. "What outcome are you looking for?" I had thought about that question since the moment I stood up from that table on Father's Day, and I had a precise answer. "I want the practice to stop," I said. "Not just for me. For the next family that sits down there thinking they're going to celebrate something. And I want there to be a cost, a real cost, for the fact that it happened. I'll make a call tomorrow morning," she said. The call Patricia made was to Bernard Holloway at Holloway and Associates on South College Street, which was, as I came to understand, one of the most respected civil rights litigation firms in the Carolinas. Bernard had been practicing for 16 years, had litigated cases before the Fourth Circuit, held a Spelman College faculty family connection through his wife, and was a member of Omega Psi Phi. He was also, as I discovered in our first meeting, exactly the kind of man I had always tried to hire when I was running Whitfield Logistics, someone who was sharp enough to be dangerous and disciplined enough not to waste it. Bernard reviewed my notes and the Father's Day documentation and asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Would you be willing to meet with 2 other individuals who have contacted our office with similar experiences at the same establishment?" I said yes without hesitation. The 2 individuals were Cynthia Griggs Monroe and Thomas Beaumont. We met on a Wednesday morning at Holloway and Associates in a conference room that looked out over the parking structure on South College Street, which was not a particularly inspiring view but suited the nature of the conversation. Cynthia was 68 years old, a retired Charlotte Mecklenburg School's English teacher with 34 years of service, a woman who had the bearing of someone accustomed to being underestimated and who had long since stopped, adjusting her expectations downward to accommodate it. She had visited Magnolia Table 3 times over the preceding 5 months, once with her book club, once with her daughter and son-in-law for the son-in-law's birthday, and once alone on a weekday afternoon. On each occasion, she had left without receiving her complete order. On the book club visit, 2 members of her party had their desserts brought out. The remaining 3, all black women, did not. When Cynthia asked about the missing desserts, she was told they were coming out, and they never did. She had paid the check and left without saying anything because, as she put it in that conference room, "I've learned to pick my battles," and at that point, I was just tired. I understood exactly what she meant. Thomas Beaumont was 55, a financial advisor at a wealth management firm in Ballantine, well-dressed and precise in the way that people who manage other people's money learn to be. He had visited Magnolia Table twice, both times, despite having a confirmed reservation, requesting window seating, the kind of request he made because of a light sensitivity issue his ophthalmologist had documented. He was seated at the table adjacent to the kitchen entrance. On the second visit, he had shown the host his reservation confirmation on his phone, which clearly noted the seating preference. The host had smiled and told him the window tables were all reserved. Thomas had looked at 3 empty window tables during the course of his meal. When he mentioned this to the manager on duty, the manager had offered him a 10% discount on his next visit. He had not returned for a next visit. Instead, He had called Bernard Holloway's office. 3 separate complainants. 3 separate time frames spanning more than 5 months. Consistent, specific, documented patterns. The same establishment. Bernard filed the formal complaint with the North Carolina Human Relations Commission on a Thursday morning. By the following Monday, a compliance review had been formally initiated. Davenport Hospitality Group LLC was served notice that same week. I want to tell you what I did the evening after I learned the complaint had been filed, because it matters to understanding what came next. I drove to First Baptist on Beatty's Ford Road, not for a service. It was a Tuesday, but because the church kept its sanctuary open on weekday evenings for members who needed quiet. I sat in the 4th row from the back, which was where Carolyn and I had always sat, and I stayed for perhaps 40 minutes. I did not pray for anything specific. I did not rehearse what I hoped would happen. I simply sat in the particular quality of silence that old sanctuaries hold, the silence that has absorbed 100 years of sorrow and joy and the specific weight of Black American worship, and I let myself be still. When I left, I felt something I recognized from my working years as the state that preceded clarity. Not peace exactly, readiness. It was that Monday evening when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had learned in my business years that an unknown caller who needs you will call back, and one who doesn't call back didn't need you. But something, instinct perhaps, or the particular attentiveness that comes when you know a situation is in motion, made me answer. "Is this Harold Whitfield?" The voice was male, 40-something, trying to hold a careful register and not fully succeeding. Slightly too fast. Slightly too controlled, which is the same as not controlled enough when you know what to listen for. "It is," I said. "This is Gregory Davenport. I own Magnolia Table on East Boulevard. I understand you may have been part of—" He paused, recalibrated. "I understand there's been some kind of complaint filed, and I wanted to reach out personally to Mr. Davenport," I said. And I kept my voice the way my father had kept his voice in every difficult conversation I ever witnessed him navigate. Level, unhurried, with the particular authority that comes not from volume but from certainty. I think any conversation between us needs to happen through our respective attorneys. I'd encourage you to contact Bernard Holloway's office. I wish you a good evening." I ended the call. I set the phone on the counter and stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking at the cherrywood table, and I thought about my father pressing suits on Beatty's Ford Road for 30 years without once asking the world to see him. I thought about what it had cost him and what it had taught me. And I thought about the fact that I was standing in a kitchen I owned in a house I had paid for outright in a city I had helped build, and that the man who had just called me was doing so from a position of defensive panic because the world had, after all, worked the way it was supposed to work when people with standing and patience and the willingness to stay the course actually used those things. The compliance review moved with a speed that surprised even Bernard. Within 10 days of the filing, investigators had completed their initial assessment. Within 14 days, formal findings had been issued documenting probable cause for violations of North Carolina General Statute 99-1. The findings cited testimony from all 3 complainants, timestamped documentation, and a review of the restaurant's internal service records, which, under the scope of the investigation, Davenport had been required to produce. Those records, it turned out, told their own story in the aggregate. Certain tables, the tables consistently assigned to or occupied by Black patrons, showed measurably lower service interaction rates, longer wait times between courses, and significantly higher rates of incomplete or unclosed orders than the restaurant's overall averages. Numbers that could not be explained by staffing patterns or kitchen timing alone. It was the kind of evidence that made attorneys sit up straight and restaurant owners lose sleep. It was also during this period that I had the conversation with Derek Hargrove that I had been preparing for since the Thursday golf round with Raymond. I wanted to be thorough before I sat across from Derek. I did not want to appear to be improvising or, worse, leveraging a personal grievance without the substance to justify the weight I was placing behind it. I spent 3 days reviewing the lease documentation a third time, pulling together the complaint findings and preparing a summary document the way I would have prepared an executive briefing for a board presentation. Clear, organized, no word wasted, every claim supported by a specific citation. I drove to Derek's office on a Wednesday morning. His building was in the South Park area, the 14th floor of a glass tower that on a clear day gave you a view of the city stretching east toward Concord and northwest toward the Catawba River. The receptionist greeted me by name. I appreciated that. And Derek met me himself at the elevator bank with a handshake that was firm and unhurried, which told me he was not treating this as a courtesy call. We sat in his conference room. His assistant brought coffee without being asked. The table between us was long and clean and professional, and I set my summary document on it with the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly what he had brought and what it meant. I walked him through it methodically. The Father's Day incident, the return observation, the formal complaint, the probable cause findings from the commission, the lease structure, specifically Section 14B and Section 19C, which I had tabbed and highlighted. I explained what the findings meant in the context of the conduct clause. I explained what Section 19C authorized the trust to do and what it arguably required the trust to do given the documented findings. Derek listened the way good executives listen, without interruption, without telegraphing reaction, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes steady. When I finished, he looked at the tab sections of the lease for a long moment. "Harold," he said, "I want to ask you something directly. Please, what do you want the outcome to be? Not legally. I understand the legal picture. I mean for the people involved." It was, I thought, exactly the right question, and it told me something valuable about Derek Hargrove. "I want the behavior to stop," I said, "permanently and verifiably. I want there to be a mechanism, a real mechanism, not a promise, that holds this man accountable going forward. And I want the people who work in that building under those conditions to work somewhere that has been put on notice, formally and with consequence, that what happened there is not acceptable." Derek nodded slowly. "Give me 48 hours. He called back in 31. The trust formally initiated the lease review on a Friday afternoon. Davenport was served notice that same day. Under Section 19C, he had 30 days to respond. His attorney, a Charlotte-based commercial litigator, who sent a letter notably devoid of the aggressive posturing that usually opens these exchanges, reached out to Holloway and Associates in 11 days, not with a rebuttal, with a request for a meeting to discuss terms. The meeting took place at Holloway and Associates on a Tuesday morning. I was not present. I had given Bernard clear instructions about what I considered acceptable and what I would not endorse, and I trusted him to represent the precisely which he did. Cynthia Graves Monroe and Thomas Beaumont were separately represented by attorneys at a partner firm. What Davenport agreed to, in the end, was this: an independent operational audit of the restaurant's seating and service practices, to be conducted by a third-party hospitality compliance firm within 60 days. Mandatory public accommodation law training for all front-of-house staff, to be completed within 30 days and documented. Formal written apologies to each of the 3 complainants, drafted without qualification or deflection, and a renegotiated lease addendum that placed the restaurant under a probationary compliance. Structure: quarterly reviews by the trust for 24 months, with specific measurable benchmarks tied to equitable service standards across all patron demographics. Failed 2 consecutive reviews, and the trust had the right to initiate early termination proceedings. He also, in the week before the agreement was finalized, quietly terminated Brittany's employment. Bernard disclosed this in the settlement documentation as a matter of transparency. I sat with that information for a while when I read it, because I wanted to be honest with myself about how I felt. Not triumphant. Not satisfied. There was no version of someone losing their livelihood that I was going to celebrate. What I hoped, genuinely hoped, in the way you hope for things you have no control over, was that the severance from that job would be the beginning of some real reflection on her part. Whether it was, I would never know. That part was not mine to own. Now I want to tell you about the phone call. The one from the beginning. The one you've been waiting for. The one that put me on my feet in the middle of that restaurant on Father's Day. Because here is what actually happened in that moment. And here's what I meant. It wasn't Davenport's number. It wasn't Bernard's. I wasn't calling the health department or a reporter or anyone with institutional authority. I called Raymond Ellis. I called Raymond because at the precise moment I stood up from that table, straightened my jacket, and understood with absolute clarity what I was going to do about what had just happened. I needed to say it out loud to someone who would understand it. Someone who had known me long enough to hear the specific register of that statement and understand that it was not drama. It was a decision. Raymond, I said, when he picked up. Harold, you all right? I'm at Magnolia Table on East Boulevard. Father's Day lunch? I paused. We're not going to be here much longer. A brief silence. Raymond had known me for 29 years. He understood the syntax. What happened? I'll explain when I see you. But I want you to know, I'm closing it. I kept my voice level. The dining room was very quiet around me. I was aware of eyes. I did not mind. Whatever this is, whatever this place is, I'm not walking away. I'm closing it. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then, I know you are. Call me tonight. I set the phone down on the white tablecloth. I looked at Marcus Jr. He looked back at me with an expression I had seen on his face only once before, at Carolyn's funeral, when he had held himself together through the service and only allowed himself to break in the car afterward. It was the expression of a man who is choosing not to feel something fully until it is safe to do so. We're leaving, I said. But not because they won. We paid the drinks check. I folded 4 $20 bills and placed them directly into Dion's hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "This is for you. Your service was exceptional. None of this is your doing." He thanked me quietly, and I saw in his face the specific relief of a young man who had been carrying the weight of an environment he hadn't created and couldn't fix. We walked out into the June afternoon, the three of us, onto East Boulevard, where the trees were full and the heat was real, and the city went on doing what it always does, indifferent to the small private disasters and dignities that happen inside restaurants and conference rooms and phone calls every day. I kept my word. 3 weeks later, sitting at the kitchen table with Raymond on the phone and the yellow legal pad open in front of me, I began to close it. Now let me tell you what happened after. Because the story that starts with humiliation and ends with justice is only half the story. The other half is what you do with yourself once the justice is done. Bernard called me on a Friday afternoon to confirm the agreement had been signed by all parties. I thanked him, told him his fee was fair and his work was exceptional, and ended the call. I went out to the back porch, a deep screen porch that Carolyn had designed to catch the afternoon shade, and I sat there with a pain d'oeillet, glass of sweet tea, and the specific quiet that follows the end of something you have been carrying. I did not feel elated. I did not feel vindicated in the loud, dramatic way that makes for good stories. What I felt was the particular satisfaction of a man who had set out to do a specific thing a specific way and had done it. Clean. Measured, without losing himself. Marcus Jr. called that same evening. He had been patient through the entire process, asking questions when I allowed it, respecting my silences when I didn't, trusting the framework the way I had always tried to show him was worth trusting. When I told him the agreement was signed, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, are you okay?" It was, I realized, the first time he had asked me that question directly since Father's Day. He had been so focused on whether the strategy was working that he had been holding back the more fundamental question, the one that mattered most. "Yes," I said, and I meant it fully. "I am genuinely okay." "Good." Another pause. "Can I take you to dinner Saturday?" "Yes," I said, "but somewhere with a decent wine list." He laughed. The laugh he inherited from me. Short, dry, slightly delayed. The laugh of men who find things funny without needing to perform it. We went to a Creole restaurant in Dilworth that had opened the previous autumn. One that a colleague of Priya's had recommended with specific enthusiasm about the Gulf seafood and the house-made cornbread. The host greeted Marcus Jr. by name from the reservation. Our server, a woman named Kaisha, attended to all three of us equally, without hierarchy or omission, with a warmth and knowledge that made the meal feel like the celebration it was supposed to be. The Gulf red snapper with crab beurre blanc was the finest piece of fish I had eaten in Charlotte in years. The collard greens were finished with smoked turkey from a farm in Shelby, North Carolina. The cornbread was made with stone ground meal from a mill in Edgefield County, South Carolina, and it tasted like something my grandmother would have approved of without saying so. I ordered the Malbec, a 2021 Chavel Ferry from Mendoza, which Keisha recommended without hesitation when I described what I was looking for. It arrived in 4 minutes, and it was exactly right. At some point during the meal, Marcus Jr. looked at me across the table and said, "You never actually told me what you meant on the phone that day. When you said, 'I'm closing it,' I assumed you meant some kind of business thing. But that wasn't it, was it?" I set down my fork. "No," I said. "It was your grandfather's phrase. When he was working at the cleaners and a customer treated him in a way that crossed a certain line, he would come home and say to your grandmother, 'I'm closing it.' It didn't mean he was quitting or walking away. It meant he was making a decision. It meant he was done extending good faith to a situation that had shown him it didn't deserve it. It meant we move now, and we move with intention." Marcus Jr. was quiet, turning that over. "He used it maybe 4 times in his life that I know of," I said. "He was not a man who closed things lightly. But when he did, it was done." "And what happened those times?" Marcus Jr. asked. I smiled. "Things changed," I said. "Because that's what happens when a man who has been patient past the point most people could endure finally decides that patience has served its purpose." Priya was looking at me with the expression she sometimes had, the quiet intensity of a woman absorbing information and integrating it in real time. "Do you think she knew?" Priya asked. "Brittany, do you think she understood what she was doing?" I thought about that honestly. "I think she knew she was treating us differently," I said. "Whether she understood why she was doing it or what it meant or what it would cost, I don't know. That's the part I can't give you. I only know what I observed and what I chose to do with it. You chose not to become it," Marcus Jr. said. I looked at my son, this 31-year-old man who had his mother's smile and his grandfather's patience and something entirely his own that I had not taught him and could not take credit for, and I felt the specific pride that has no adequate language. The pride that is not loud. The kind that sits in your chest like something permanent. "That's the only choice that matters," I said. The cornbread arrived for the second time. Marcus Jr. had asked Keisha to bring another round, and the conversation moved, the way good conversations do, away from what had happened and toward everything else. Priya's research project, Marcus Jr.'s new apartment in Noda, my Thursday golf game with Raymond, whether I was finally going to take the trip to Charleston I had been putting off for 3 years. I had not lost anything that Father's Day. I know that now in a way I may not have fully known in the moment. I had been given, instead, the kind of test that you do not ask for and cannot decline. And I had moved through it the way my parents had raised me to move through things. Not above them, not around them, but directly through, without leaving anything of yourself behind. My father pressed suits on B's Ford Road for 30 years. He kept his code every one of those days. He passed it to me in the manner of men who don't have time for speeches. Through example, through consistency, through the particular way he set down whatever he was carrying whenever a principle required him to pick up something heavier. I have tried to keep his code. I have tried to keep it on the days it was easy, and on the days it cost something real. I will keep it for whatever years I have left, because the alternative, becoming the thing that disrespects you, matching contempt with contempt, shrinking the world to fit the size of someone else's smallness, is not a life I am willing to live. Father's Day will come around again. When it does, I plan to sit at a good table with good people and order the wine I want, and it will arrive in 4 minutes, and it will be exactly right. Thank you, sincerely, for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that patience is not weakness, that dignity is not passive, and that the truth, when you carry it carefully and deploy it precisely, does not need a raised voice to be heard. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. Leave a like if this story gave you something worth keeping. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.